Welcome to Rapid Gulp. My name is Matthew Branley, and I'll be teaching you the ins and outs of using Gulp for web development. I've been using Gulp for the past year on quite a few projects, and I've really enjoyed its speed and flexibility. We've got a lot to learn though, so let's get right into it. Gulp is a build tool, or a task runner, which essentially means that we can describe our build process to Gulp, and it will reliably repeat that process over and over again. For example, a build process might include concatenating and minifying JavaScript files, but Gulp can also improve the process of building a website with tools like auto reload, which reloads your browser whenever a file is edited. Many tools like this have sprung up the last few years to improve web development and make our lives easier, but your process might involve many of these tools. Gulp can connect them all together, making it easier to manage. Now that we have an idea of what Gulp is, let's talk about why you might use Gulp over other options out there. A few years ago, a task runner called Grunt was created. Many task runners came before it, but this one was specifically geared towards web development. It was great, and lots of people used it. But when your build got more complex, Grunt was sometimes difficult to configure and often slow to run. Later, Gulp came along and was built with a different approach that helped solve these problems. Gulp uses streams, which tend to be fast and work really well for complex build processes. We have a quote here about using programs like garden hoses, connecting them together end to end, and streams let you do just that. I highly recommend reading the Stream Handbook if you want to learn more about them, but the basics are pretty simple. Data will flow from a source to a destination, and along the way, we can pipe it into plugins, which each plugin can modify the data as it passes through. So let's talk about this course. In the next few videos, we'll get Gulp set up on our computer and run through the fundamentals of using Gulp. At that point, we'll be ready to learn about some common uses for Gulp, which should allow you to take advantage of Gulp on your own projects. And finally, we'll dig into some topics that we've brushed over, like streams, handling errors, and extending Gulp with custom plugins. We've learned a little something about Gulp, and we've got a plan, so it's time to get to work. In the next video, we'll get Gulp set up and ready to go. Now that you have an idea of what will be covered in this course, the first thing we need to take care of is installing Gulp on our computer. We're going to get everything set up during this video so that we're ready to use Gulp in the future. With npm, installing Gulp is really easy. Feel free to take a look at this page, but what we really need to do is go to our terminal. We'll type npm install -g gulp to install Gulp. The G tells npm to install it globally. This gives us the Gulp command on our terminal, which is how we'll interact with Gulp. When you run Gulp on a terminal, it'll look to see if Gulp has been installed in your local folder. This way, individual projects can specify what version of Gulp to use. So now that we have Gulp installed globally, we're going to need to install it again locally. So let's just type npm install Gulp to do that. If we run Gulp, we'll see that no Gulp file was found. So let's make one. Here in our text editor, let's create a file called gulpfile.js. We'll save that right there. When we run Gulp, we'll be able to execute any tasks that we've defined within our Gulp file. The first step to defining any task is to require Gulp within our Gulp file. Gulp has methods that make defining a task really easy, so we need to have it in there. So now, we've installed Gulp on our system, both globally and in our local project. We created a Gulp file and required Gulp within that file, so we're all set to go. In the next video, we're actually going to create our first task. So now that we have Gulp set up, let's write our first task. We'll need to install a plugin that will be used in our task, and then we'll see how to actually run that task from our terminal. In web development, we'll often want to concatenate several files together into a single file. Here on npm, there's a plugin called Gulp Concat, which will help us do just that. We'll use this plugin to join a few JavaScript files together. We have 3 trivial JavaScript files here in our source folder, and we're going to join them all into a single file. Each file just logs out the name of that file so that at the end we can see that they've been concatenated together. The first thing we need to do is install Gulp Concat. So let's go to our terminal and type npm install gulp-concat, and that'll download the plugin. Clicking back to our text editor, we'll run a require Gulp Concat at the top of our Gulp file. So now we'll want to define a task. There are a few functions in Gulp that make this really easy. We'll begin by using gulp.task to define a task called JS. We also need to pass it a function, which is where we'll define the actual behavior of this task. Gulp.source is used to define what files we want to manipulate. So let's grab all the JavaScript files. Gulp will select all the files that match this pattern in alphabetical order. If we wanted to specify the order, we could pass an array and list the files explicitly. We'll want to pipe those files into gulp concat, which will handle joining them all together. And now we'll want to write the result to a destination file using gulp.dest. All we have to specify is what folder those files end up in. So finally, we'll want to run that task. We'll go to our terminal, and since we already installed Gulp, we should have a Gulp command. When we run Gulp, it'll look for a Gulp file.js in our current directory, where it'll find the task that we just defined. Since we could have defined multiple tasks, we need to tell it which task to run. So let's type gulp.js, which will run the JS task. And now, our files have been joined together into a single file just like we've hoped. We can briefly look here and see that our file looks exactly like we expected. So we've taken our JavaScript files, installed a Gulp plugin, and joined those files together with Gulp's help. So now you should understand the basics of writing a task, but we've still got a lot to learn. Next, we're going to see how we can make more complex tasks by combining a group of smaller subtasks. Now that we've written a simple task and learned the basics, let's learn how we can define more complex tasks by connecting a few smaller tasks together. Often in our build process, we'll want to do something different with different types of files. Like maybe we're combining our JavaScript files, but we're creating copies of our images at various resolutions as well. We would define these as separate tasks, but it'd be more convenient if we could just call a single task that makes sure that both of those subtasks get done. To keep things simple, we'll just define a couple tasks that join files together, but we'll join those subtasks into a single larger task to illustrate the point. The first step is really easy. We'll create a second task that looks a lot like our first task. We'll call this task other.js, and instead of getting all the JavaScript files, we're going to list an array here and specify that we just want two of them. We're going to take a and source/b.js. We'll combine those into a file called 2.js, and they'll still go to our dist. So let's quickly run this task and make sure that it works. We'll type gulp other.js, and looks like it worked. At this point, we could run each of these tasks separately, but it'll be more convenient if we can combine them into a single task. With Gulp, it's pretty easy. Let's write a new task called default. Normally, we would define a function for what this task does. So let's write a really simple function that just logs out, you did it. On its own, this task isn't very useful. But you can tell a task that it depends on other tasks, meaning those other tasks will run first, and once they've all completed, the parent task will execute. So let's add an array that specifies that the default task depends both on the JS task and the other JS task. If we go back to our terminal and run gulp default, we'll see that both JS and other JS ran, and then you did it got printed out. You could have named this task anything, but there's a reason I picked default. Default is special because you can just run gulp and it'll look for a task called default. That's pretty convenient. So we looked at how we can define more than one task and how we can join tasks together into a more complex task. At this point, we know quite a bit about gulp. Since a default task can be called by simply typing gulp, we can run those tasks quickly, but it gets even better. In the next video, we'll see how gulp can actually keep an eye on our files, and if they change, it'll run the appropriate tasks. That way, your destination files will automatically stay in sync with your source files. Now that we can write complex tasks, let's look at how we can have those tasks run automatically with gulp watch. This way, your destination files always stay up to date with your source files. While working on our website, it would be really annoying if we had to keep running our build process over and over again. Luckily, Gulp has our back. In our text editor, as you might guess, we're going to define a new task. Let's create a task called watch, and within it, we're going to use a new method called Gulp watch. We'll pass it two things: where the files are that we want to keep an eye on, which they're all in our source folder. We also need to pass what task should run if those files change. So we'll just run our default task. We could break this up more, but let's just watch all our source files and run our default task if anything changes. Over on our terminal, we now call Gulp watch to run the task. This task won't run and finish like we've seen with other tasks, since we want to keep it running so it can find out when any of our files are updated. Finally, let's update one of our JavaScript files and save it. On our terminal, we'll see that those tasks all ran again. Back in our text editor, we'll see that if we look at all.js, for example, the updates have already been applied. Same thing for 2.js. So we learned about a new watch method on Gulp and defined a task that automatically ran our build process whenever our source files changed. With these tools, we can focus on creating our website without worrying about the build process. At this point, we know a lot about Gulp. We've covered all the basics and reached the end of this section. In the next section, we'll learn how to run common tasks, and we start by optimizing our files for production, including our CSS, JavaScript, and image files. So now that we're familiar with the basics of using Gulp, let's take a look at some common tasks that Gulp can help us with. In this video, we'll be optimizing our JavaScript, CSS, and image files. When you write code, or let's say export an image from Illustrator, those files usually have unnecessary data in them. This data can be useful during development, but our web browser doesn't need it. If we push those files straight into production, our website will take longer to download than it needs to. So let's speed things up. So first of all, we need to install a few plugins. We need a separate plugin for our JavaScript, our CSS, and for our images. So here in our terminal, let's use npm to download these. We have Gulp uglify, which will handle our JavaScripts, Gulp minify CSS, which will take care of our CSS, and Gulp image min for our images. Now that we have those plugins, let's include them in our Gulp file and write a few tasks. So we need to include uglify, minify, and image min, and so we'll write a JS task. And that task will pipe our JavaScript files /JS through concat and through uglify before writing them to our destination. For images and CSS, it's basically the same pattern. So we're going to copy this. We'll rename this one CSS. We need to grab our CSS files. We're not going to concat it. And then we'll pipe it through minify before setting it to our destination. And then for images, we need to get our PNG files. We need to pass that through image min and send it to our destination. We'll tie all these together by defining a default task. That task will just rely on our JS, our CSS, and our images. Finally, let's go to our terminal and try it out. If we run Gulp, it'll run our default task, which should take care of all our files. If we compare the files that we started with the files that Gulp just created, we'll see that they're quite a bit smaller. So there's our source files, and here are our final files. And if we compare these file sizes, all three files are smaller now. To get a better sense of what happened, let's take a look at the JavaScript file we just created. If we take a look at this, all the white space, all the comments have been taken out. Variable names are a lot smaller, and it's much, much smaller than the file we started out with. So we installed a few plugins and wrote a few tasks to handle our website's assets. Gulp was able to strip out unnecessary data from our files, and now our website will download more quickly. We covered a lot in this video. We downloaded a few plugins. We wrote tasks for optimizing the CSS, JavaScript, and images. And we reduced the file sizes of those files. That's a lot to take in, but we'll have more time to digest everything in the next video, where we'll see how we can output both minified and unminified files in the same task. Now that we know how to optimize our files, let's look at how we can output both minified and unminified versions of our files in a single task. We'll need to get a couple plugins, we'll see how to write a task that creates two separate files, and we'll run that task once we have it. Certain build steps, like uglify, take a relatively long time to run. It's probably only a few seconds, but when you're actively developing, you want the feedback loop from writing code to running code to be as quick as possible. Because of this, you'd rather not wait for uglify. You also want to be able to read and debug your code, and uglify makes this far more difficult since it removes all comments and whitespace. Let's look at how we can write a task that concatenates our scripts and outputs an unminified version before running uglify and outputting a minified version. Before we start, make sure that you have installed gulp concat and gulp uglify and have them required at the top of your gulp file. Next thing we need to do is write the actual task. We're going to define a task called JS. That task is going to read in our JavaScript files. We'll pipe those files through gulp concat and output an unminified version. Probably noticed that we've seen code like this in the past, and we've ended the task here. But gulp.dest actually outputs whatever was inputted to it. And so we can just keep going and pipe things into uglify. Now we're going to use concat once again, but just to rename the file. At this point, we can output our minified JavaScript with gulp.dest. As usual, let's go to our terminal and run this task. From our text editor, we can see that two versions of our JavaScript files were created. This one looks like the file that we had earlier, but all.min.js has all the white space removed. So we used a few plugins we've seen before, but we wrote a task that was a bit different. Instead of ending the task after outputting a file, we continued to modify that stream before outputting a second file. With this, we are able to quickly output an unminified version of our scripts for development purposes, but our minified production file stays up to date. In the next video, we're going to check out a plugin called HTML Build, which I really enjoy using. It has a few use cases, but we'll look at combining multiple script tags into a single script tag. In the last video, we output multiple versions of our assets from a single task. Now we're going to look at a plugin called Gulp HTML Build, which allows us to modify sections of our HTML files from a Gulp task. When building a web page with a fair amount of JavaScript, we'll probably use at least a few libraries. We'd rather get all that code in a single HTTP request, which is why we've already covered concatenating scripts together. But those scripts often aren't in a single folder to start. If you're using a package manager like npm or Bower to manage your dependencies, they might be deeply nested in several folders. We're going to write a task that allows us to list our libraries as script tags in our HTML file, but we'll combine those scripts into a single file and modify this HTML to only have a single script tag linking to that new file. So let's go to our terminal, and we're going to npm install gulp HTML build. We need to add this to our gulp file. So now let's define a task called HTML. As usual, we're going to use gulp source to find our file. But this next step might look a bit odd. We're going to pipe this into HTML build, but HTML build actually takes an object of its own where we configure how it works. We'll define a process called JS, which will use HTML build.preprocess.js, and we're going to pass that a function. Now this preprocessor is going to go find our script tags, and it's going to feed them to us in this block. What we need to do is we need to write that block of scripts to a file called all.js, and then we need to end that block. Now we're going to want to output this to a file, so let's pipe this into gulp.dest as usual, specify our dist. So now over in our HTML file, we're going to add some comments, and this is going to help HTML build find what files we're looking for. Or we need a comment called HTML build::js to designate the start of where it looks, and then we need an end build comment to specify the end. HTML build is going to find all the files in between these two comments. So now if we go to our terminal, we can run this task, and it looks like it worked. If we go to our dist, we have an index.html, and it's linking to a single all.js, just like we hoped. So we learned about a new plugin called Gulp HTML Build, which looked a bit different than any plugins we've seen so far. We passed the plugin an object where we described specific processes we wanted to take care of, and we saw how it was able to process the script tags in our HTML file. HTML Build has more features, however, so I encourage you to view the plugin on GitHub and read more about it. In the next video, we'll see how we can test our code with a popular JavaScript testing library called Jasmine. In the last video, we took a look at a plugin called Gulp HTML Build. In this video, we're going to look at how we can use Gulp to test the functionality of our code. Fully learning how to test code is outside the scope of this course, but we'll take a quick look. There are a number of libraries out there for writing tests, but we're going to use one called Jasmine. Jasmine provides a few functions that help us describe how our code should behave. Once we have this test written, we'll use Gulp to execute them, which will tell us whether or not our code behaved as expected. Let's say we write a small file called multiply.js. In that file, we simply export a function. That function takes two values, and it just multiplies them together. What we'll do is we'll use Jasmine to describe this behavior. So we're going to create a folder called spec, and within that folder, we're going to create a file that's also called multiply.js. In this file, we're going to describe the behavior, but we need to actually include the actual source file. So source/multiply. With Jasmine, we can say, let's describe multiply, function, and we say it multiplies two numbers together, and we expect that when we multiply 2 by 3, we expect that to equal 6. You can write far more advanced tests than this, but this covers the basics of how Jasmine works. Let's look at how to run this test. We need to go to our terminal, and we're going to npm install Gulp Jasmine. Now that we have the plugin, let's require it at the top of our Gulp file. We'll write a task called test, and this task is going to take our spec, and it's going to just pipe it straight into Jasmine. Now over on our terminal, we can now run Gulp test, and we'll see that our spec run, and we had 0 failures, meaning our test passed. This example is trivial, but if we wrote a larger program, it would be valuable to have tests to ensure that everything behaves as we expect it to. Wiring this up with a watch task would be particularly useful since our test could automatically execute as we wrote code. So we took a quick look at how Jasmine works using a simple example. We installed a plugin called Gulp Jasmine, and we wrote a task to execute our test, showing that our function behaved as we expected it to. Next, we'll take a look at a couple preprocessors called CoffeeScript and LESS. These languages ultimately get transformed into JavaScript and CSS with the help of Gulp, but they provide some extra features that don't exist in those languages. Now that we've seen how to test our code, let's look at some neat preprocessors called CoffeeScript and LESS. I won't have enough time to dive deeply into these technologies, but I'll give you an idea of what they are so you can explore more later. CoffeeScript looks a bit like JavaScript, but the syntax is cleaner and it has a few tricks that JavaScript doesn't have. For example, the function syntax is a bit more simple. You can create objects just through indentation and quite a few other little features. However, our browser doesn't know how to run CoffeeScript, so we need to convert it into JavaScript before our browser can execute the code. Similarly, LESS has some cool features. Even things just like variables that CSS doesn't have. This makes writing CSS more enjoyable and keeps your code more flexible. Let's look at some files that are ready for us to use. In our text editor, we already have a simple CoffeeScript file written. It just defines a function, runs that function, and outputs the result. We also have a LESS file. This is the example we just looked at on the website, but basically we have a light blue variable which adds a nice blue with another color, and then our header has that color. We'll need to convert these files into JavaScript and CSS so that our browser can handle them. Let's look at how Gulp does this. As you might guess, we need to go to our terminal and we need to install some plugins. So let's grab npm install Gulp Coffee and Gulp LESS. We'll want to include both of these at the top of our Gulp file So we'll say coffee. Now let's write a couple tasks that handle each of these file types. We'll create a task called coffee. This task will grab our source/coffee. We'll pipe it into coffee, and we'll pipe it into Gulp dest to create a file. Similarly, for our less file, we'll create a task called less, and we'll have our less file. We'll pipe it into less, and we'll pipe it into Gulp dest. Let's tie these together with the default task. And now from our terminal, we're going to run that task, and we'll see that our files look like plain old JavaScript and CSS now. So we had some code written in CoffeeScript and LESS, but we used a couple Gulp plugins to convert them into JavaScript and CSS so that our browser knows how to execute them. If you've never used these technologies, I really encourage you to try building something with them. You can wire them up with a watch task like we've seen in a previous video, and there should be practically no delay between writing code and viewing the results in your browser. In the next video, we'll see how we can make that feedback loop from code to results even quicker with a plugin called Live Reload. It will handle automatically reloading our browser for us after we've made changes to our code. In the last video, we took a look at CoffeeScript and LESS, but now we'll see how to speed up our development process using a tool called Live Reload. With Live Reload, our browser will automatically refresh whenever we save changes to our code. When developing a website, especially when making changes to CSS, it's helpful to quickly get visual feedback and see how our changes affect the look of our site. With Live Reload, as the name suggests, the feedback is automatic. To get started, let's install a plugin called Gulp Connect from our terminal. This plugin allows us to easily start a small local server to host our files, but it comes bundled with Live Reload, allowing us to get set up quickly. Now let's take a look at our Gulp file. I already have a simple task here called copy that just takes an HTML file from our source directory and copies it to the dist directory. We also have a watch task to keep an eye on our HTML file and copy it whenever it changes. We're going to extend these tasks to add Live Reload. Since we installed Gulp Connect, we should require it. As I mentioned, Gulp Connect can handle running a local server to host our files, so let's write a task to handle that. We'll just call it Connect. Connect has a method called server, which takes a few options. We'll specify that we want this server on port 8000. We also need a root, which is where our files are located. Since we're writing files to the dist directory, that's where we'll point our server. And we'll also specify that we want to use Live Reload. At this point, we can run a server, but we're not quite done. We have a watch task, which will fire a copy whenever our HTML file changes, but we need to modify the copy task. After copying the file, we'll pipe into connect.reload, which will reload our browser. As usual, let's write a default task that connects this all together. We'll want to copy our files, start watching those files, and turn on a server. We should be all set, so let's go over to our terminal and let's run Gulp. Since we specified port 8000, let's go check out localhost 8000 and we'll see rapid Gulp in our browser. If we go to our text editor and modify the file, let's say we add a paragraph about this course is great. When we save that file, if we go back to our browser, the text is already there waiting for us. We covered a lot in this video. We used a new plugin called Gulp Connect to run a local server with Live Reload. Then we modified our existing tasks so that whenever those tasks run, they tell Connect to reload our browser. Now we get instant feedback whenever we update our website. In this whole section, we looked at a lot of use cases for Gulp. We covered everything from improving a website directly by optimizing files and modifying them within a task, to improving our development process through writing tests using preprocessors like CoffeeScript and utilizing auto reload. In the next section, we'll dive further into Gulp and learn more about how it actually works. Now that we've seen a number of common uses for Gulp, let's dig a bit deeper into how Gulp actually works. In this section, we'll talk more about streams, which is how data flows through Gulp. We'll take a look at the FS module, which lets us interact with the file system. We'll see how to open streams both for input and output, and we'll listen for data from the input stream so that we can write to the output stream. In past videos, we've seen a lot of code that follows the same pattern, where we call gulp.source to read in some files. We pipe those files through a number of transformations, and then we pipe it into gulp.dest to output our final product. Calling gulp.source creates a stream that reads from the file system. But what does that actually mean? Streams are really just objects that fire events. If we write plugins that use streams as their common interface, we're able to create small, modular components that can be wired together in any order we need. We've been doing this with a pipe method in Gulp, but for the sake of learning, we'll interact with events directly in this video. Let's take a look at a concrete example. We're going to read in a file, make all the text in that file uppercase, and write it out to another file. Using the built-in module called FS, which stands for file system, we'll read a file in with a stream. So first, we need to require FS, and then we just call fs.createReadStream and pass it the name of the file that we're going to read, which is this doc.txt over here. We'll also want to create a write stream. So we'll call fs.createWriteStream, and we'll pass it the name of the new file we're going to create, which is doc.uppercase.txt. So now let's listen for some events. When our input stream fires a readable event, that means there's data in the stream waiting to be read. So we can call input.read, which will return a chunk of data in the form of a buffer. We want to turn that buffer into a string, which will allow us to call toUppercase on that string, which is just a method built into JavaScript. To write this uppercase string to our output stream, we'll just pass it into output.write. At some point, the input stream will run out of data, and it'll fire an end event. When that happens, we want to take our output stream and call end on that, which just tells it that we're done writing information to it. So now in our terminal, we can run this file, and if we look back in our text editor, we'll see doc uppercase exists, and the text is all in uppercase, whereas the original document was not. So it looks like it worked. So hopefully we have a better idea of how streams work, but we definitely haven't covered everything. If you want to learn more, I encourage you to check out the Stream Handbook, which you can find here on GitHub. It goes into far more detail and shows you a lot of useful things you can do with streams. So we wrote some code that streams a file from our computer, transforms that file, and outputs the changes to another file. But the code we wrote looks a lot different than what we see in Gulp. Using pipe to connect streams, like we see in Gulp, is really just a more convenient way of wiring up events. But understanding that streams are just objects that fire events will help us in the future. In the next video, we'll look at how to handle errors in Gulp, which mostly involves listening for events. So now that we understand a bit more about streams, let's look at how we can listen for some events and handle errors in our Gulp tasks. For example, if we're using CoffeeScript, like we looked at in a previous video, we might run into some errors if we used any invalid syntax. Usually, we'd set up a watch task to keep an eye on our CoffeeScript files, which would run a task to transform them into JavaScript files. If CoffeeScript throws an error and we don't catch it, it'll break our watch task, pulling us out of our workflow. So we have a Gulp file here already, which looks like something we've seen before. However, the watch task is prone to breaking if we write any invalid CoffeeScript. Let's look at how we can handle those errors. So the first thing we need to do is we need to listen for an error event right after we pipe our files into Coffee. So we'll say .on error, and we'll connect that event to a function called handleError. So now we're expecting a handleError function to be defined, so we need to create one. So we'll make a function called handleError. This function is going to take an error, and we'll just log out that error, which is just convenient for us, and we'll emit that this stream has ended, which will just keep it from continuing forward since it's broken. So now if we go to our terminal and we run our watch task, we can see that it stays open watching our files. And so we can go back to our text editor. We can go to our CoffeeScript file. We can write some invalid syntax, just throw some things in here. And if we save that, it's going to run our watch task. We'll see that we have a syntax error here, but our watch is still running. If we weren't listening for that event, it would have stopped our watch altogether and pulled us out of our workflow. So we listened for an error event on the stream right after we piped it through Coffee. We defined a function to handle the error, and we saw how this will prevent the error from breaking our watch. In the next video, we'll dive even deeper and write our own plugin that we can use within Gulp. Now that we've learned how to handle errors in our Gulp files, let's look at actually writing a Gulp plugin so that we'll better understand how Gulp works internally. We're going to write a plugin that simply uppercases all the letters in any files that you pass through it. We'll need a module called through_to, which will help us define a transform function to uppercase a file's contents. Finally, we'll run our new plugin and see that it works. It's rare that you'll ever need to write a plugin from scratch, but writing one is still a helpful learning exercise. Potentially, you'll come across a plugin that isn't working correctly, so this video should give you a starting point for fixing an existing plugin. Gulp has very strict guidelines for creating a plugin. For instance, you must have tests. We won't worry about all of these, since we're not publishing this module, but we'll at least create a plugin that does one thing and does it well. If you plan on publishing a Gulp plugin, you should give this document a thorough read. In order to write a plugin, we'll need a package called through_to, so let's install it with npm. Through_to is used in most existing Gulp plugins, and it's simply a wrapper around streams that make it easy to define a transform function, which is exactly what we want when we transform a file into uppercase letters. We have a file here called Gulp capitalize, where we'll define our plugin. Let's require through_to at the top. We're going to export a single function, and that function will be called Gulp capitalize. Within that function, we're going to return an object string by calling through.obj. This function takes a single function, but we need to pass that function a few things. First, we'll get the file that we need to transform. We'll get the encoding of that file, and we'll get a callback that we need to call once we're done doing anything that this plugin does. In our case, that means after we capitalize the file, then we'll call this callback. There are a few different situations we need to handle in this function. For example, if the file is null, then there's nothing to uppercase. So we're just going to call the callback, and we're going to pass the file straight through. So this might be slightly confusing, but most plugins handle the file contents as a buffer, especially if they need to manipulate the entire file at once. Since this is an acceptable pattern, we're going to restrict our plugin so that you can't stream the actual contents of the file that you pass into our plugin. So what that looks like is we need to check if the file is a stream, and if it is, then we're going to emit an error, and that error is going to be a plugin error that says the name of our plugin here and the error message, which is that streams are not supported. So wrap that up. Now that we've emitted the error, we just want to call the callback, and we'll be done with that. So this will look very similar to what we did a couple videos ago, but basically, if the file is a buffer, which is what we want, then we're going to overwrite the file contents. Those file contents enter as a buffer, and so we need to overwrite them with a new buffer. And what that looks like is we'll have file.contents, and we'll need to stringify those contents since it's currently a buffer. We'll call toString with the given encoding, and then we'll call toUppercase. And this will overwrite the file contents with a buffer containing the old contents that have been uppercased. So at this point, we've done what our plugin needs to do, and we can call the callback and pass it this newly modified file object. I have an existing Gulp file here that pulls in the plugin we just wrote. It feeds our text files through this plugin, which would capitalize it. We handle any errors that we might run into, and then we output it to our dist folder. The only text file we have here is that same text file we saw a couple videos ago. So if we go to our terminal and we run this, then we'll see back in our text editor that we have a dist folder now. Within that folder is a new doc.txt, and that doc.txt has our text in it, except it's all capitalized, just like we hoped. So we used a module called through_to to write a Gulp plugin. Our plugin was mostly a transform function where we needed to handle a few different use cases, since the file might be null, a stream, or a buffer. Running our new plugin from a Gulp file showed that it actually worked. We're almost done with this course, so in the next video, we'll just be wrapping up and sending you on your way with all these new things you've learned. Now that we've seen how to build a Gulp plugin, we've basically reached the end of this course. We've covered a lot so far. When we first started out, we learned the basic structure of how to write Gulp tasks, but we quickly put that knowledge to use and wrote a number of common tasks that we might run into when developing a website. After that, we dove a bit deeper into Gulp and learned about streams, error handling, and how to write a plugin. At this point, you probably have a good idea of how Gulp can be useful, and you're able to write a Gulp file to suit your needs. It's important to understand that Gulp files come in many shapes and forms, depending on a specific project's needs. I encourage you to look around GitHub and find projects that use Gulp. Since all that code is open source, you can see how they're leveraging Gulp in that project and probably discover some new plugins. As with most things in technology, the key to learning is to try it out yourself. So I encourage you to use Gulp in an upcoming project while this knowledge is still fresh in your mind. Thanks for taking the time to watch these videos. I hope you learned a lot and that Gulp makes web development more enjoyable for you.